Wonderful. All right, thank you so much for having me. My name is Will. I'm not an economist, so this is terrifying for me. I work at a thing called the Refugee Studies Centre in Oxford, and this paper, the lion's share of the credit, goes to Alex Teitelboim, who I can't see, who's vanished, with whom I wrote much of the original stuff, which I'll be speaking about today. We should also thank INET and the Refugee Studies Centre for their unstinting support of all of this stuff. So, I'm sure it will not come as any surprise to anyone in the room that we face a global refugee crisis, but just how bad things are is worth stressing, let's say. This is the highest recorded number of refugees in the world ever. This figure includes the internally displaced, roughly 38 million of them. It includes the 5 million under UNRWA's mandate, the Palestinians. So the ones UNHCR is dealing with alone still get us up to over 16 million. Over half of those people are in what's called protracted situations. They've been refugees for over 5 years, on average 17 years. This is a situation where an overwhelming majority of them, not an overwhelming majority, very, very large numbers of them are new refugees as well, from Syria, and also now from Afghanistan and Somalia. What's also new about this situation is this is the first mass influx of refugees into Europe. We've had mass influxes before, but they tend to stay in the developed world, which is perhaps why this is getting so much attention. Very, very briefly, I'm going to sort of summarize the entirety of the international refugee regime in about 45 seconds. There are two things the international refugee regime is designed to provide: asylum and burden sharing. Asylum is when you walk or you get on a boat and you make to another country and you claim asylum there. This is, surprisingly enough, an incredibly well-institutionalized norm of international law. States go to great lengths to try and subvert that law or minimize irregular arrivals, but they very rarely ignore it entirely. The second bit it's supposed to do is provide durable solutions to those refugees by engaging in burden sharing, helping out the states that are hosting asylum seekers in the first instance in a variety of ways. And there are 3 ways you're supposed to help refugees. So refugee status is supposed to be temporary. It is not supposed to last 17 years. We're supposed to offer you one of 3 things at some point. One of which is repatriation. We send you home when the reasons why you became a refugee have ceased to exist. The second one is local integration. We give you nationality or some form of permanent status in the country in which you became a refugee initially. And the third one is resettlement. So, in this context, I want to talk about 2 types of inequality. The first is inequality on the part of states. So the framers in 1951 knew perfectly well that the nature of the world was such that most of the world's refugees were likely to be created in particular bits of the world, that odds on refugee crises would be geographically concentrated and refugee flows would be disproportionately falling on particular states. So there is an inequality in terms of the burden to provide asylum. So for example, 1 million of the world's Somali refugees are in Kenya. The overwhelming majority of the world's Afghan refugees are in Pakistan. Indeed, I think something like 57% of the world's refugees are in 10 countries, and 30% of the world's refugees are in 3 countries, which is Turkey, Pakistan, Lebanon, I think. The second kind of inequality is inequality on the part of refugees themselves. Refugees have very unequal access to resources. Some of them are able to access smuggling networks, which are extremely expensive. Some of them are not. Some of them, via familial networks or sources of information, are able to access migration into Europe. Other people get stuck in refugee camps in Jordan or in Turkey that are unsafe, inhumane, and do not provide basic human rights standards. The answer, the intended answer to both of these forms of inequality is resettlement. Resettlement is the key system whereby the international refugee regime tries to share burdens and give them to other countries. So, in the context of 61 million refugees, the number of refugees we resettled last year was 107,000, which is a scarce resource. So it is worth thinking in that context about the most efficient way to allocate it. So we're not talking today, Alex and I do not work on how to increase those numbers, although inter alia we argue if you use resettlement more sensibly, some states might be willing to raise capacity. What we're talking about is how you determine which refugees, with the very limited set of resettlement places you have, end up in which places. And the thought is that this is a matching market. It's already a matching market. In order for a refugee to be resettled, a state and a refugee need to agree to match, but we're trying to think about ways in which it can be redesigned to work for both sides. There's two core implications. So internationally, you could have a hypothetical system where, say, the European Union or some larger group of states wanted to share burdens on resettlement, and Hillel, along with Jesus Fernandez Huertas Moraga, did I get that in the right order? Yes. Have written quite extensively about that. And there's also locally, how you work out whether a refugee should be in Chicago and New York, or Bognor Regis, or Droitwich, or Vancouver versus Alberta. Now, there are, and Alex, David, and Scott, all of whom I think are in the room, have written a very exciting paper about that, which you should ask them about. Just very briefly, there are lots of very different systems as to how refugees get allocated in different countries. Britain has a very top-down, centralised model where one government agency assigns refugees to local areas, but local areas voluntarily participate and reveal their capacity to host. At the Canadian level, there's all sorts of different statuses. Most of the refugees that come to Canada historically have been privately sponsored by individuals who named the refugee that they were willing to take. The new systems, so all those lovely pictures you saw of Justin Trudeau hugging Syrian children in airports, those refugees are being resettled by the state. The state doesn't really have much idea of where it's going to put them. A lot of them are still in resettlement centres, which are converted army bases, which, as you can imagine, are delightful. And in America, there are 9 voluntary agencies, largely run by churches, that have a system where they compete over who ends up with which refugee, and then they decide to allocate refugees to different dioceses or whatever. So there's lots of different ways in which refugees are allocated, but in most cases the ways refugees are currently allocated is by people engaging manually, or what we're calling bespoke resettlement. There's people shuffling paper, trying to work out on behalf of refugees where they reckon refugees might be best suited. At no point are refugees systematically asked what they want, nor, on the other hand, are the capacities of communities, or at a higher international level, states, systematically elicited and matched either. So, that slide, that's supposed to be a hidden slide because I had too many and I'm aware that I'm running out of time already. How much time have I got left? 10 minutes. 10, cool, okay. So, let us start by pointing out that there are good reasons to believe that refugees have very different preferences over where they go. This is a story, it's because it's a PDF. That's why I did it. Never mind. There are good reasons to believe that refugees have very different preferences over where they want to go. This is a recent story from Finland, where refugees were sufficiently horrified by Finland that they were willing to voluntarily repatriate to Iraq. The more generalized version of this phenomenon...
This happens in February.
I mean, there are many things that are nice about Finland that some refugees might like about Finland. The important thing is to find those refugees and end up in Finland. The more general problem is refugees get settled to areas they don't want to go, and they move. They drop off the radar of the state, they enter slums, they become radicalized, they become vulnerable to forms of predation and exploitation. So refugees have quite diverse preferences as to where they want to end up. And states have pretty diverse preferences as well. So this is from, you probably can't see this is from a scheme called EUREMA, where various European states agreed to resettle largely Libyan refugees from Malta a couple of years back. I'm indebted to Hillel for pointing this out to me. What this shows is that the different states participating in the schemes had very different ways of establishing priority over the refugees that they were willing to resettle. So here's Romania behaving very badly, and here's Britain behaving oddly well. Which is unusual for my country, so that's nice. But more generally, you might think that states might reasonably disagree about the order of priority. States might have reasonable disagreements about what constitutes the most vulnerable or the most persecuted, and more than that, states might have reasonable disagreements about who they are best placed to protect, who is most likely, for whatever reason, to integrate into their country, who is most likely to have, the right kinds of languages, or there's a pre-existing diaspora, etc., etc. So this is a situation where there's good reason to believe that both states and refugees themselves have quite diverse preferences. Equally, This, if I was Viktor Orban, is the graph that will be keeping me up at night. There are reasons to believe that some countries that are particularly opposed to hosting refugees might be more willing to do it if you could persuade them that the refugees that they were going to get might be able to fill particular core skills gaps. Many people find this incredibly repugnant. It would be a simple matter to exclude skills from a match if you wanted to. But equally, for something like an international match, where realistically the participation of states is going to be voluntary, this might be a key way to persuade states like Hungary to participate in resettlement. Boom. Here are guesses as to what refugees might have preferences over. It's important to point out that we don't know, though, because no one has ever asked them. Which is to say, many agencies, often committed agencies of bureaucrats that really are trying to do their best, are guessing on behalf of refugees as to what they care about most. We currently don't systematically ask them, nor do we have any way right now to know how they would make trade-offs if, say, employment opportunities are in one place and family reunification opportunities are in other areas. So, equally, states have a large set of priorities, and we're guessing that this is what it is. And in particular, a lot of the work on migration and like voting behavior about migration suggests that the really big thing that motivates anti-migration sentiment is not the raw numbers. It is the perception that you are losing control of your borders. And that is an incredibly psychologically powerful phenomenon that, in stark contrast to the actual raw numbers, which doesn't really tell you anything about whether or not a country is violently anti-migration or not, the perception of a lack of control over borders is a really powerful tool for whipping up xenophobic anti-migration sentiment. One of the things a match can do is offer, therefore, management and control and a degree of predictability to refugee resettlement and to asylum, which currently states lack. So, boom, 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 boom. This is the bit I'm going to skip. Very briefly, I'm now going to move to the local areas. So there's really good evidence that putting refugees in particular areas has really long-term durable consequences for their life, even when they're subsequently allowed to move. So Sweden had a absolutely random resettlement policy where they put refugees in every area of the country more or less at random. And even though subsequent to that refugees were allowed to move, where refugees were initially placed had very dramatic effects on their livelihoods. So again, this suggests not just at the inter-country level, but at the sub-national level, trying to find a way to get refugees into the right areas might be very, very important for minimizing the long-term expense to the state, maximizing the long-term probability that refugees will be able to integrate successfully, maximizing the likelihood that communities will actually be happy with the refugees that they are hosting, and so on and so forth. So I've spoken about that. So here's the British example, which is the state that is currently closest to implementing some version of this for the 20,000 refugees that they currently plan to be resettling before the end of this parliament. So in about 3 weeks, I suppose. So the British system wants to match refugees and local areas. Local areas are participating voluntarily and have very different bundles of services. So refugees often have a quite complex set of needs in healthcare, social care, education, mental health assistance, and so on and so forth. And so the plan is to try and develop a system where local communities don't, as they are now, generously opting into participating in resettlement only to find out that they're being matched with refugees who they lack the capacity to deal with, which leads to them not volunteering the next time round. It leads to refugees being unhappy in the areas where they've actually been settled and dropping off the radar, and so on and so forth. Boom, 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 boom. So, I'm going to end here. I've got about 3 minutes left, I think.
5.
Whew, okay. Further questions, things to be dealt with. So, unlike school choice, where children tend to enter school at the same time and you do it all in one large batch, the ideal system for refugee resettlement is likely to be a dynamic one, where both refugees entering the resettlement system happen incrementally, but also, on the other hand, refugee capacity enters the system not all at once, not predictably, but at very unpredictable rates. So, for example, British local councils might find out they have housing stock at a particular point in time, and if you had to wait until the match is made in 6 months' time, that housing will no longer be available. It was on a waiting list, it's gone to a private landlord, etc., etc., etc. So ideally, you would want a dynamic matching system. I'm not quite sure how I would do that. Secondly, over and above where we place people, but when we have decided they are being resettled, there is a question about how we determine who is to be resettled, who is to get local integration. Currently, that operates on a scale of vulnerability and on a lack of self-reliance. So the most vulnerable, least self-reliant refugees are most likely to get resettled. This has obviously perverse consequences for the incentives of refugees in various areas and their incentives to try and become self-reliant where they are currently based. So that is an aspect of the system that needs to be, I think, more sensibly designed. Common but differentiated responsibility is the slogan coined by Hathaway and Neve in, I think, 1997 for the idea that some states should be able to exchange, in Hillel's terms, physical for financial solidarity. So do you want a system where some states are willing to contribute finance and other states are willing to contribute capacity, and you've got to make that finance move to the areas where it is most successful? Hillel and his colleagues have proposed a tradable quota system. That's one way of doing it at the international level. He's proposed it in the EU context. There's other proposals floating around. So that's something I'm going to flag there. Fourthly is the idea of clustering in communities. We know a lot in the migration studies literature about the circumstances under which some forms of clustering lead to really vibrant, socially mobile communities, and other forms of clustering lead to really socially destructive ghettoization. So we know a huge amount about the circumstances under which particular migration patterns do or do not either lead to people becoming stuck or people becoming socially mobile. So one of the things that would be great to think about is how you could try and design a market to try and make sure that you've got the right kinds of communities forming the right kinds of clusters, such that people were most likely to be able to be socially mobile, flourish, etc., etc., etc. Finally, we know people will move. That's more or less guaranteed. People in a sort of European system, your refugee status is geographically limited, so you're not actually legally allowed, say, if you're a German refugee, to just move to Belgium. But people will if they're unhappy enough. There is a general recognition amongst European policymakers that they've basically run out of coercive instruments. They can't stop people moving forcibly if they are determined to. But we don't yet have enough carrots to kind of minimize secondary movement. A match that works is one of the ways of trying to do that. But we should recognize that refugees will continue to move as and when things don't work out for them, or as and when they get a bit more secure, a bit more willing to try something else, and so on. So our design of the market should try and incorporate the idea of secondary movement and the anticipation of secondary movement flows. The more general point I want to make that emerges from some of these is there's a lot of quantitative literature where we know a lot about migration and a lot about the circumstances under which migrant communities do or do not do well. The things Alex and I have currently been thinking about is to do with designing the market with a view to efficiency, stability, and things like that. A further task that might be interesting or constructive to think about would be how you would design a market based on the kind of social aims or benefits that is identified in the migration literature. How do you design a market for upward mobility? How do you design a market to create productive diaspora communities, and so on and so forth. And I think that will be exciting, and Hillel's waved a thing at me, so I'll finish there. Thanks.